Horror is one of the few genres in gaming that seldom ever falters in popularity, thanks in large part to how creatively versatile it can be. However, arguably the most important aspect of this genre is its foundation, which is solidly built on quintessential classic survival horror experiences provided by some of the most memorable and recognizable IPs in the industry. Survival horror is all but synonymous with the likes of the Resident Evil and Silent Hill franchises, along with other stray hits like Clock Tower, Haunting Ground, and Alone in the Dark. These games showcase a mastery of classic horror within the medium, though Resident Evil and Silent Hill have obviously both started to adapt and modernize their experiences with their more recent games and remarkably impressive remakes. Nonetheless, the classic, terrifyingly tank-controlled adventures that made these household names what they are today can never be forgotten, even if the gameplay style has long since been left to rest. That is, until Dual Effect's Tormented Souls first made its unexpected appearance in 2021. Initially debuting on PC before eventually branching out to every major platform, this indie survival horror gem managed to strike a nostalgic chord with those of us who still look back fondly at 90s-era horror gaming. Most of all, it clearly recognized the influence of Capcom's Resident Evil series on other horror IPs during that era, and presented itself as a delightfully gruesome love letter to the franchise that arguably started it all. In the few years since its release, Tormented Souls went on to become an undercover hit among long-time horror fans, resonating strongly in many respects despite its flaws, and leaving an impact that's honestly quite impressive for a small-scale development team. However, Chile's Dual Effect succeeded in making its mark, as news of a direct sequel to Tormented Souls led to plenty of hype among its devoted fanbase. Now that Tormented Souls 2 has landed, the question stands if a sequel to this nostalgic survival horror fever dream was worth the wait. Does this continuation in Caroline Walker's story properly build upon the terrifying experience of the first game?
Puzzles. Lots of puzzles. If there's one particular aspect of gameplay in the first Tormented Souls that stuck out among players, it was definitely the puzzles. Around nearly every corner in the game, there was another puzzle to solve, and a number of them were truly cryptic head-scratchers that required some serious thinking outside the box. This was evidently meant as an authentic homage to Resident Evil's penchant for thematic puzzles, so the inclusion of them was certainly warranted and welcomed. There is absolutely no shortage of puzzles in Tormented Souls 2, and you'll need to dust off your survival horror thinking cap for many of them, as puzzles are once again the key to progression in Caroline's story. The main thing to note with these types of puzzles, however, is that in that classic survival horror fashion, completing them often requires a lot of backtracking and running around for specific, often inconspicuous items that serve as the fateful pieces. That's something that can resonate with certain horror-attuned audiences, but not necessarily with others who expect the whole of the puzzle to be in close enough proximity to progress at the pace they wish. A good chunk of the puzzles in the game are well placed and provide that fascinatingly eerie allure to the already unsettling environment that is Villa Hess. Outside of the lens of classic survival horror, some of it can understandably feel borderline nonsensical or absurd. In other words, a medieval statue with a ridiculous amount of bells and whistles that ultimately dispenses an ordinary item. Resident Evil's puzzle culture was well known for that absurdity, and it's a characteristic feature that you'll either love or get frustrated over.
Combat is classic, but underwhelming.
The combat in Tormented Souls is all but synonymous with Resident Evil's early years of infamously clunky tank controls and weapon handling. It's a style that has its charm, but it can be difficult to warm up to if you've never experienced it. No over-the-shoulder aiming, no strafing, no John Wick-style reloading, and dodging is all but non-existent. It definitely takes practice to get the hang of, much less master. As expected, Caroline's weapon skills are just as clunky in the sequel, which is fine on its own. Classic survival horror all but expects it, and while she's not in any way a professional, she knows her way well enough around a nail gun and a few other unique weapons. There's virtually no difference between Tormented Souls 1 and 2 in terms of combat mechanics, so don't expect any innovative changes. What's more of a letdown is the underwhelming similarity of the arsenal Caroline gets this time around. The nail gun makes its return, along with the uniquely designed shotgun, melee weapons like the crowbar, and more. It's all very predictable, which can bring a sense of safety, perhaps, for those more anxious with survival horror games. An entirely different setting should have warranted a considerable change-up of weaponry to help freshen up the experience for veterans and newcomers alike who may jump into the sequel first. It feels like a missed opportunity to show an impressive range of different types of weapons you could wield with this style of combat.
An odd follow-up story with decent closure.
One of the biggest questions that lingered on many players' minds after the finale of the first Tormented Souls was where Caroline's story could possibly go after the events at Wildberger Hospital. Granted, the potential endings you get in that game each paint a very contrasting picture, but the canon seems to follow the best ending, which sees Caroline successfully escape the hospital with 10-year-old Anna. The sequel picks up a few months after the events of the first game, with Caroline and Anna both still suffering from the trauma of their recent experiences. Anna is notably more afflicted, however, with nightmarish visions that still leave her unable to reclaim a relatively normal childhood. Desperate to find an effective, therapeutic solution for her adopted sister, Caroline takes her on a trip to a remote town in Chile known as Villa Hess. The town is apparently home to a clinic that Caroline believes will help Anna, but upon arriving at the religious convent that houses it, things take a turn for the worse rather quickly. Once again, poor Anna gets kidnapped by what turns out to be a sect of violent zealots that resides within the convent. The whole situation is eerily similar to what she endured in the first game, which begs the question of why exactly Caroline thought this was a good idea to begin with. Definitely have to deduct a few big sister points for that one. That narrative lapse aside, the remainder of the story is nonetheless spine-chilling and fascinating at a good number of moments. Caroline lets nothing stand in her way of reuniting with Anna, no matter how bleak the situation becomes. She also runs into a handful of other mysterious characters along the way that offer their help, though not without their own motives at play. Familiar supernatural themes also make their return in the sequel, particularly with Caroline's strange and insufficiently explained abilities to phase walk to the other side and time travel between the past and present. Tormented Souls 2 features multiple endings that can each lead to very different outcomes depending on your actions in the latter half of the story. Each of them is equally fulfilling and helps provide that replay incentive that classic survival horror often gravitates to. Assuming that the canon again pivots toward the best ending of the sequel, it remains to be seen if we'll see Caroline and Anna in yet another adventure. All in all, this newest chapter is fun and thrilling enough, but its premise still felt a bit too familiar to the first game for my liking. While paying homage to an acclaimed survival horror franchise is plenty admirable, if you still want to tell your own story, it needs to be memorable. Even with the huge geographic jump to the Southern Hemisphere and all the narrative possibilities that could entail, it feels like Tormented Souls 2 played it rather safe in terms of story and character development.
Deservedly thrives on nostalgia, but sadly, not much else.
There's no denying that Tormented Souls 2 knocked it out of the park with its various thematic nods to Resident Evil's strongest classic features, along with hints of other renowned horror IPs like Silent Hill and Alone in the Dark. If there ever was a game that you wanted to help you relive that same nostalgic feeling those games gave you years ago, then this surprise survival horror gem from Dual Effect is about as close as it gets. On that front alone, Tormented Souls unequivocally deserves those accolades. This series is first and foremost a love letter to those legacy IPs who've done some of the best for the horror genre, period. However, that palpable nostalgia is still a two-way street. While it will resonate strongly with those who savor those classic survival horror experiences, those who know little of it or don't care for it for one reason or another may not feel the same connection. On top of that, the overall storyline of Tormented Souls is not that memorable or innovative. It obviously harkens to many familiar Resident Evil-esque narrative and environmental elements. Zombie-like enemies, evil cults galore, ritualistic sacrifices of damsel characters, underlayers of supernatural and scientific elements. However, even if all of that is well and fine in terms of nostalgic storytelling, Caroline Walker is just not that memorable of a protagonist either. Her universe and personal story are both surface level at best, even with the events that occur in the first game. With not enough depth given to her overall character development, with everything that occurs, it mostly feels like she's just going through the motions, as it were. Her existence is just that, existence. Secondly, while I don't want to place too much blame on this for what Dual Effects still accomplished, the character design, dialogue, and voice acting are still rather lackluster this time around. While there is some degree of improvement, Caroline's verbal reactions throughout the game are still pretty awkward. Sadly, it's not dorky awkward in a way that would make it charming, it's just awkward. Anna's dialogue and mannerisms are at least more realistic of a traumatized adolescent. It all leaves the game feeling like it's meant to be just a nostalgically horrific joyride supercharged with nostalgia, with no true intent to build a new universe around Caroline or anyone else in her universe. Closing thoughts. Tormented Souls 2 is a fun, albeit thematically predictable, sequel to a game that served as a delightfully nostalgic surprise to longtime horror fans. It's abundantly clear that Dual Effect has put their heart into this ongoing love letter to classic survival horror, utilizing elements that few other horror indies have dared to touch in favor of modern playstyles and concepts. Charmingly familiar tank control gameplay, ambitious puzzle mechanics that can still feel a bit too heavy-handed for the average player, and thematic horror elements that do work well for the most part. Like its predecessor, Tormented Souls 2 still struggles with storytelling and character elements that just don't quite hit the mark. While it doesn't go as deep as I would like, above all else, it still serves its grandest purpose with all the passion you could ask for.